The HOA president stood in my dead wife's memorial garden, measuring tomato plants with a silver ruler, writing citations that would total $350,000. What Veronica Ashford didn't know was that she was trespassing on my land. Her house, built on my land. The entire subdivision of 127 homes? All on my 340 acres. And I had the receipts to prove it. I'm Clayton Brewster, 58 years old, and this is the story of how I went from the most hated man in Willow Spring Estates to their landlord, and how one woman's vendetta against my late wife's memory led to the exposure of a 33-year-old fraud that victimized an entire community. If you've ever dealt with an HOA from hell, if you're hiding in the bathroom right now to escape another mind-numbing meeting, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Because this story has everything: corruption, bribery, federal investigations, and the sweetest revenge you've ever heard. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. My grandfather bought these 340 acres in 1952 when this was nothing but farmland and dirt roads. He raised cattle, grew corn, and built the stone house where I still live today. Sarah and I moved into the old homestead when we got married 35 years ago. She fell in love with the place immediately, especially that patch of earth where she'd eventually plant her heirloom vegetable garden. For 3 decades, she nurtured those tomatoes, peppers, and herbs like they were her children. When the cancer came, that garden became her sanctuary. Even during chemo, she'd drag herself outside to tend those plants. She passed 2 years ago, and I've kept that garden going ever since. Every morning, I water those same heirloom varieties, pull the same weeds, and remember how her laugh used to echo across the property. But while Sarah and I were living our quiet life, the world changed around us. In the 1990s, developers bought up the surrounding farmland and built Willow Spring Estates. 127 luxury homes with perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and gates that kept the outside world at bay. They formed their HOA in 1995, complete with architectural committees and violation enforcement. For 27 years, we coexisted peacefully. Then Veronica Ashford moved in. Veronica's 45, drives a silver Lexus that's shinier than my grandfather's surveying equipment, and wears pearl earrings to morning violation inspections. She moved here from some expensive coastal city, convinced she needed to bring proper standards to our rural community. The woman actually carries a sterling silver ruler to measure fence heights and a laminated list of approved plant species that's longer than most restaurant menus. Last spring, she got herself elected HOA board president with promises to elevate property values and maintain community aesthetics. Translation: get rid of anything that looked like it belonged to the original families who'd been here for decades. Her first target? Sarah's memorial garden. Agricultural use in a residential zone, she declared, slapping me with a $2,500 fine. Then came the fence, the same stone and wire boundary my grandfather built in 1952. Non-conforming boundary marker, she said. $8,500. The old well house where Sarah stored her garden tools? Unpermitted structure. $15,000. Each citation felt like a punch to the gut. This woman was systematically attacking every place that held memories of Sarah. The garden where she taught neighborhood kids about vegetables, the fence where she hung bird feeders every winter, the well house where she'd sit and plan next season's plantings. But Veronica was just getting started. She brought in her brother-in-law Marcus, some city inspector who owed her favors, and together they found 47 additional violations. My gravel driveway, the same one that had served 4 generations of Brewsters, suddenly needed modern paving standards. $85,000. The stone chimney that had warmed our house since Eisenhower was president? Structurally non-compliant. $45,000 more. Even the old oak tree where Sarah used to hang her bird feeders got cited for hazardous overhanging branches. The sound of those violation notices hitting my mailbox became like a death knell. Every morning I'd walk down that gravel drive, crunch, crunch, crunch under my boots, and find another citation waiting. The numbers kept climbing. $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. My insurance company started making noises about cancellation due to ongoing code violations. The bank sent lien notices. I was selling Sarah's antique furniture just to pay the initial fines, watching pieces of our life together disappear to fund Veronica's vendetta. By month 3, the fines had climbed to $182,000. But she wasn't done. Not even close. One Tuesday morning, I heard the familiar purr of her Lexus pulling up my driveway, followed by the rumble of a city truck. Through my kitchen window, I watched Veronica emerge in her regulation HOA uniform, navy blazer, those pearl earrings catching the sunlight, and that clipboard she wielded like a sword. For the next 2 hours, I watched them manufacture violations out of thin air. The wooden shutters my grandfather hand-carved? Non-approved exterior fixtures. The rain gutters that had worked perfectly for decades? Improper drainage system. When they finished, Marcus handed me a citation packet thick enough to choke a horse. 47 new violations, each with its own fine and compliance deadline. The total was approaching $200,000, more money than I'd made in the last 5 years combined. That's when something inside me snapped. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. Sarah used to say I was too trusting, too willing to let people walk over me. But staring at those citations, I realized I was fighting for more than just money. I was fighting for her memory, for my grandfather's legacy, for the right to exist on my own land without harassment. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to start digging. The basement records room smelled like old paper and forgotten promises, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. I started pulling property records, deeds, surveys, anything related to the original development of Willow Spring Estates. Most people don't understand how property law works, but I'd learned a few things during my years as a hydrogeologist. When you're drilling wells, you deal with property rights, easements, mineral ownership, all the complicated legal stuff that determines who owns what beneath the surface. What I found in those dusty filing cabinets made my heart race. The original 1987 deed for my grandfather's land sale wasn't a standard property transfer. It was something called a development rights lease. In simple terms, my grandfather had sold the right to build houses on his land, but he'd retained ownership of the land itself. Think of it like renting out your basement. The tenant can live there, improve it, even sublet it, but at the end of the lease, it's still your basement. The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. If my grandfather had only leased development rights, then technically. But when I tried to get copies of the supporting documents, Nancy, the county clerk, gave me the runaround. Those records might not be available, she said, avoiding eye contact. Sometimes older files get misfiled or damaged. Interesting. How the sister-in-law of the city inspector suddenly couldn't locate the exact documents that might challenge the HOA's authority. I spent 3 more days in that records room, going through every box, every misfiled folder, every forgotten cabinet. Finally, in a box marked Development Projects, Miscellaneous, I found what I was looking for, a carbon copy of the original contract, complete with my grandfather's signature and a very specific clause about land ownership retention. The fines were now accumulating at $500 per day. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope stirring in my chest. That's when I called Eleanor Patterson. Eleanor, 73, runs a genealogy research service out of her home office, and has a reputation for finding property records that everyone else claims don't exist. She's the kind of woman who remembers when the courthouse burned down in 1967 and knows which records got saved, which got lost, and which got accidentally misfiled by bureaucrats trying to cover up their mistakes. Clayton, she said when I explained my situation, you're talking about the old Clearwater Development Project. I remember when they first broke ground. Your grandfather was pretty upset about something back then, but nobody knew exactly what. Eleanor charged me $500 to do a complete property history search. 2 days later, she called with news that changed everything. You need to sit down for this, she said. I found the original survey maps from 1987. Your grandfather's 340 acres included the entire footprint of what's now Willow Spring Estates. Every house, every street, every common area, it's all built on the original Brewster farm. The implications were staggering. If Eleanor was right, then 127 families were living in houses built on land that had never been properly transferred away from my family. But the real bombshell came when Eleanor tracked down the surveyor who'd handled the original property mapping. Tom Bradley, now retired but still sharp at 78, remembered the Brewster project like it was yesterday. Your grandfather was very specific about the boundaries, Tom told me over coffee at the local diner. His weathered hands sketched the property lines on a paper napkin. He wanted to make sure the development rights didn't interfere with the mineral and water rights. Smart man. Most farmers back then didn't understand the difference between surface rights and subsurface ownership. Tom explained something I'd never fully understood about property law. When you own land, you don't just own the surface. You own everything underneath it too, unless specifically sold separately. Mineral rights, water rights, even the right to determine what gets built on top. Think of property ownership like a layer cake, Tom said. You can sell the icing without selling the cake underneath. Your grandfather sold the right to build houses, but he kept the foundation, literally and legally. The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. If Tom and Eleanor were right, Then Veronica wasn't just harassing me with illegal fines. She was doing it while standing on land that legally belonged to my family. I drove home that afternoon with my mind racing. The foreclosure deadline was 18 days away. My legal fees were approaching $25,000. But somewhere in those courthouse records was the proof I needed to turn this whole situation upside down. 3 weeks later, Veronica called an emergency HOA board meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but the results showed up in my mailbox the next morning: a foreclosure notice and a 30-day eviction order. According to the official letterhead from Peyton and Associates, some high-priced law firm from Indianapolis, the HOA was exercising its right to foreclose on my property due to chronic non-compliance with community standards and failure to remit assessed penalties totaling $247,000. $247,000 for violations on land my family had owned since Harry Truman was president. I called my daughter Jessica in Portland that evening. She's an environmental lawyer out there, works with timber companies and water rights disputes. When I read her the foreclosure notice over the phone, the silence stretched so long I thought we'd lost connection. "Dad," she finally said, "this doesn't sound legal. HOAs can place liens, but foreclosure for code violations in 30 days without a court hearing? That's not how this works." "Well, their lawyer seems to think it's how it works," I said, staring at the stack of legal documents spreading across my kitchen table. "Says here I need to vacate the premises within 30 days or face criminal trespassing charges." Jessica was quiet for another moment. "Dad, I'm flying home this weekend. Don't sign anything. Don't pay anything. And whatever you do, don't leave that house." But the financial pressure was crushing. Between the mounting fines and legal threats, I was bleeding money faster than I could earn it. I sold my grandfather's collection of surveying equipment, brass instruments that had mapped half the county back in the day. Then went Sarah's china set, the one her grandmother had given her for our wedding. Each sale felt like cutting away pieces of my life, but I needed cash for lawyers and research. Eleanor called me back a few days later, excitement crackling in her voice. "Clayton, I need you to understand something crucial about 1991. That was the year Clearwater Development Company went bankrupt." Eleanor tracked down Richard Sterling, Clearwater's attorney back then, now 81 years old and living in a retirement community outside Tampa. And here's the kicker: he'd been waiting 30 years for someone from the Brewster family to call him. It turns out Richard Sterling had tried to contact my family multiple times after Clearwater's bankruptcy, but we'd moved to temporary housing while renovating the old farmhouse, and his letters never reached us. He'd kept copies of all the relevant documents in his personal files, waiting for the day when the property ownership question would inevitably surface. "Your grandfather was very specific about retaining land ownership," Sterling told me during a crackling long-distance phone call. His voice was gravelly but sharp. When Clearwater filed for Chapter 11 in 1991, they hadn't completed the land purchase payments. Under federal bankruptcy law, incomplete property transfers automatically revert to the original owner. The legal principle is called equitable reversion, and it works like a rubber band snapping back. When a buyer goes bankrupt before completing a property purchase, ownership automatically returns to the seller, regardless of what's been built on the land in the meantime. Sterling had the documentation to prove it: payment schedules showing Clearwater owed my grandfather $180,000 in final payments when they went under, bankruptcy court filings confirming the incomplete transfer, and most importantly, a letter from the bankruptcy judge stating that the Brewster property reverts to original ownership. "Son," Sterling said, "you've owned that entire subdivision since 1991. Every house, every street, every blade of grass. The residents think they bought their properties from Clearwater, but Clearwater never legally owned what they were selling." The implications were staggering. Veronica hadn't just been harassing me on my own land. She'd been doing it while living in a house built on my land, elected to an HOA governing my property, issuing fines for violations of rules she had no authority to enforce. Sterling agreed to overnight the original documents to my lawyer's office. As I hung up the phone, I looked around my property with new eyes. The gravel driveway Veronica wanted paved? My driveway on my land. The fence she'd cited as non-conforming? My fence marking my property boundaries. The woman had been standing in my backyard issuing me citations for code violations on my own property while living in a house she had no legal right to occupy. Tomorrow I was going to start issuing some violations of my own. Eleanor Patterson arrived at my house on a Thursday morning carrying a leather satchel that looked older than both of us combined. Inside were photocopies of documents that would change everything: my grandfather's original safety deposit box contents, discovered at a bank that had been sold 3 times since 1987. Clayton, she said, spreading the papers across my kitchen table, your grandfather was smarter than anyone realized. The centerpiece was a contract dated September 15, 1987, between William Brewster and Clearwater Development Company. The language was crystal clear, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting with annotations in the margins. 99-year development rights lease, Eleanor read aloud. Total consideration $89,000 paid in full. Land ownership retained by Brewster family in perpetuity. But that wasn't the most important part. Stapled to the back was a handwritten letter from my grandfather to his lawyer explaining his reasoning. I don't trust these city developers, he'd written. They promise the moon and disappear when things go bad. I'm selling them the right to build houses, nothing more. When that 99 years is up, or if they fail to honor their obligations, this land comes back to my family clean and clear. Eleanor pulled out another document, Clearwater Development's bankruptcy filing from October 1991, just 4 years after the original agreement. The company had sold house lots to 127 families, promising them fee-simple ownership, full property rights. But according to the bankruptcy court records, Clearwater had never owned fee-simple rights to sell. They'd only leased development rights from my grandfather. It's like renting an apartment and then subleasing it to 100 families, telling each one they own the building, Eleanor explained. The original landlord, your grandfather, still owns everything. The financial implications made my head spin. If I owned the land under all those houses, then technically every family in Willow Spring Estates had been living on my property without permission since 1991. 33 years of unpaid ground rent at current market rates, roughly $850 per month per lot, totaled over $28 million. But the real revelation came in the final document, a title insurance investigation report that Eleanor had commissioned independently. The report confirmed that Clearwater Development had committed massive title fraud, selling ownership rights they didn't possess to over 100 families. Every house deed in that subdivision is invalid, the title investigator had written. The underlying land ownership was never properly transferred from the Brewster family. I sat back in my kitchen chair trying to process what this meant. Veronica Ashford, HOA president, violation enforcement officer, destroyer of Memorial Gardens, had been living in a house built on my family's land for the past 3 years. She'd been elected to govern property she had no legal right to occupy. She'd been issuing fines for code violations on land that belonged to me. The woman had been trespassing while writing me tickets for trespassing violations. Jessica flew home and immediately got to work. The legal strategy is straightforward, she explained over coffee in my kitchen. We file trespassing notices on every property, demand back rent since 1991, and offer residents 2 options: purchase their lots at the original 1987 price, or enter into monthly ground lease agreements. While Jessica prepared the legal paperwork, I ordered signs. Not just any signs, but professional aluminum property markers from a company that specializes in legal notifications. 127 identical signs reading, private property. No trespassing. Brewster Family Land Trust, with citations to the relevant state statutes about unauthorized occupation. Tom Bradley agreed to do a complete boundary verification using the original stakes his crew had placed 35 years ago. We spent 3 days with metal detectors and Tom's original field notes, locating the buried brass discs that marked the corners of my grandfather's 340 acres. Each one we found was another nail in the coffin of Clearwater Development's fraudulent scheme. I installed security cameras at key locations around the property. Not spy cameras, obvious, visible deterrence with legal notification signs. The goal wasn't to catch anyone by surprise, but to create a paper trail of documented trespassing violations. Eleanor, meanwhile, was working her magic in the courthouse records room. She'd found marriage certificates, death certificates, and property transfer documents going back to the 1800s, building an ironclad chain of title that traced every acre from the original homestead grant to my current ownership. The most crucial ally turned out to be Jake Morrison, my neighboring farmer. Jake's family had owned the adjoining property since the 1920s, and he'd been present at several meetings between my grandfather and the Clearwater developers. Your grandfather never trusted those city folks, Jake told me over dinner at his kitchen table. He made them put everything in writing, asked a lot of questions about what happened to the land if their company went belly up. Smart man, he saw this coming. Jake agreed to provide a sworn affidavit about those conversations, remembering specific details about my grandfather's concerns and the developer's promises. The final piece of the puzzle was media coverage. Jessica had contacted Lisa Chong, an investigative reporter from Channel 7 who specialized in consumer fraud cases. Lisa was fascinated by the scope of the title fraud and the David versus Goliath angle of an individual taking on an entire subdivision. "This has all the elements of a great story," Lisa said during our interview. "Corporate fraud, family legacy, property rights, and a community that had no idea they'd been living a lie for 3 decades. We scheduled the evidence delivery for the next emergency HOA meeting. Jessica had prepared 127 individual trespassing notices, each one legally served and properly documented. Tom Bradley would present the survey evidence. Eleanor would explain the chain of title. Jake would testify about the original agreement. And Lisa Chong would film the whole thing. But 2 days before the scheduled meeting, Veronica made her most desperate and illegal move yet. I was coming back from Tom Bradley's farm around sunset when I noticed Nancy the county clerk's Honda Civic parked behind the courthouse. Odd, since the building officially closed at 5 o'clock. Something told me to investigate. I parked across the street and watched through the courthouse windows as Veronica emerged from the basement records room, followed closely by Nancy. They stood in the parking lot for several minutes, heads close together in urgent conversation. Then Veronica handed Nancy an envelope. I got out my phone and started recording. The conversation was too far away to hear clearly, but the body language told the story. Nancy kept shaking her head, looking nervous, while Veronica gestured emphatically with that envelope. Finally, Nancy took the money, and yes, I could see it was cash, and hurried back inside the courthouse. 20 minutes later, Nancy emerged carrying a cardboard box marked, Property Records 1980 to 1989. I followed Nancy's car to the city dump, where I watched her throw that box into the industrial incinerator. 30 years of property records, including who knows how many original documents related to my grandfather's land, went up in smoke. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse with Jessica and our attorney, demanding to see the original 1987 deed records. "I'm sorry," Nancy said, not meeting my eyes, "but those files seem to have been damaged in a recent water leak. Most of the 1980s property records are no longer available." Jessica leaned across the counter. "That's interesting, Nancy, because my father has video evidence of you destroying those records in the city incinerator last night." The color drained from Nancy's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "We also have footage of Veronica Ashford handing you cash in the courthouse parking lot," I added. $15,000 according to the bank withdrawal records we subpoenaed this morning. That was a bluff. We hadn't subpoenaed anything yet, but it worked. Nancy started crying right there at the counter, confessing everything between sobs. Veronica had approached her 3 weeks earlier after Eleanor Patterson had been requesting records. Nancy was supposed to make the inconvenient documents disappear gradually, but when she'd seen Eleanor's research getting close to the truth, Veronica had demanded immediate action. "She said it was just old paperwork that nobody would ever need," Nancy sobbed. "She said I could make my mortgage payment and nobody would get hurt." The confession was music to my ears, but there was a problem. The records Nancy had destroyed included some of the original documents we needed to prove our case. That's when Jessica played her ace card. While Nancy was destroying records at the courthouse, Jessica had been on the phone with Richard Sterling's retirement home in Florida. Sterling had agreed to overnight his complete file of Clearwater development documents, including original contracts, bankruptcy filings, and correspondence that Nancy couldn't touch. More importantly, Sterling had done something brilliant back in 1991. As Clearwater's attorney, he'd been required to file copies of all property documents with the State Land Commission in Indianapolis. Those records were beyond Nancy's reach, stored in a state facility that required federal court orders to access. Meanwhile, the bribery investigation was moving fast. I'd reported Nancy's confession to the State Ethics Board, and they'd launched an immediate inquiry into public corruption. Veronica faced potential federal charges for bribing a government official, plus state charges for interfering with legal proceedings. But Veronica wasn't done fighting. That afternoon, she escalated the violation game one more time, issuing a final citation that pushed the total fines to exactly $350,000. This time, she cited me for criminal trespassing during active foreclosure proceedings and threatened to have me arrested if I didn't vacate the property within 24 hours. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. Veronica Ashford, who'd been living illegally on my family's land for 3 years, was threatening to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. Jessica just smiled when she read the citation. "Perfect," she said. She just committed harassment under color of authority while under investigation for public corruption. The state attorney general is going to love this. The emergency HOA meeting notice went out on Friday morning. Special assessment vote. Urgent legal matter. Attendance mandatory. Every homeowner in Willow Spring Estates received a certified letter requiring them to attend Sunday's meeting to vote on a $25,000 special assessment per household, to be paid within 30 days. The letter, signed by Veronica and the HOA board, claimed the money was needed for critical legal defense regarding property ownership disputes and an emergency fund to resolve title complications. It mentioned potential liens, foreclosures, and property value impacts if residents didn't approve the assessment. What the letter didn't mention was where that money was really going. Saturday afternoon, Jessica's forensic accountant friend called with explosive news. Following the money trail from the HOA's bank accounts, she discovered that Veronica had established a shell company called Ashford Legal Defense LLC 3 weeks earlier. The company had no employees, no office, no business purpose except to receive payments from the Willow Spring Estates HOA. It's textbook embezzlement, the accountant explained. She's using the HOA's emergency powers to vote herself a $3 million payday disguised as legal fees. The math was simple. $25,000 times 127 homes equals $3.175 million, all flowing into Veronica's personal shell company. She was planning to steal millions from her neighbors to fund her defense against charges of stealing from her neighbors. Sunday evening, the Willow Spring Estates Community Center filled with angry, confused residents. Most had never seen a $25,000 special assessment before. Many were asking hard questions about why the HOA needed millions for legal defense when the neighborhood had been quiet for decades. I arrived with Jessica, Eleanor Patterson, Tom Bradley, and our attorney, carrying boxes of documentation and surveying equipment. Lisa Chong and her camera crew set up in the back of the room, broadcasting live to anyone who wanted to watch. Veronica called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing her navy blazer and pearl earrings like armor. She looked confident, professional, completely in control. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we're facing an unprecedented legal challenge that threatens the very foundation of our community. A frivolous lawsuit from a disgruntled neighbor could result in liens on every property, massive legal fees, and devastating impacts on property values." She painted me as a bitter old man trying to extort money from hardworking families, claiming my ownership documents were fabricated and designed to exploit legal loopholes. The special assessment, she argued, was the only way to fund proper legal representation against my baseless claims. But then she made a critical error. In her eagerness to demonize me, Veronica revealed that she'd known about the property ownership questions for months. She'd consulted multiple attorneys, commissioned her own title research, and even attempted to resolve the matter quietly through proper channels. In other words, she'd known my ownership claim was legitimate, which meant she'd been issuing fraudulent violations and harassment fines while fully aware she had no authority to do so. Jessica stood up during the question period. "Mrs. Ashford, if you've known about these ownership questions for months, why are you just informing residents now? And why haven't you disclosed that Ashford Legal Defense LLC is a company you personally own and control?" The room erupted. Residents started shouting questions, demanding answers, pointing out obvious conflicts of interest. Several people pulled out their phones to check the live stream comments, where viewers were posting links to the state business registration showing Veronica's ownership of the shell company. But the real bombshell came when Tom Bradley stood up to present his survey findings. Using a portable projector, he displayed the original property maps showing that every house in the subdivision was built on Brewster family land. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom announced in his clear, authoritative voice, "you've been living on someone else's property for 33 years. The moment Tom Bradley finished explaining the survey results, I stood up and walked to the front of the community center. In my hands were 127 identical envelopes, one for every household in Willow Spring Estates. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "my name is Clayton Brewster. I own the land your houses are built on." The room stayed dead quiet as I began handing out envelopes, moving systematically from row to row. Jessica and our attorney assisted, making sure every household received their packet. Inside each envelope was a 30-day trespassing notice, a copy of my grandfather's original contract, and 2 options for resolving the situation legally. Lisa Chang's camera captured every face as residents opened their letters and realized what they were looking at. Some people looked confused, others angry, A few seemed relieved to finally understand what was happening. For 33 years, I continued, you've been living on my family's land without a valid lease or ownership claim. Clearwater Development sold you properties they didn't own, using fraudulent deeds and illegal title transfers. Veronica tried to interrupt, but Sheriff Deputy Martinez had arrived as scheduled to witness the legal service. He held up his hand for silence. Mrs. Ashford, Deputy Martinez said, you need to let Mr. Brewster finish his statement. I took a deep breath and delivered the line Jessica and I had practiced. You fine me $350,000 for code violations on my own property. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Brewster Family Land Trust. Your rent was due 33 years ago. That's when the room exploded. Residents jumped to their feet, shouting questions, waving their trespassing notices, demanding explanations. But the loudest voice belonged to Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street, who'd been fighting her own HOA violations for months. Veronica, she shouted over the noise, did you know about this when you voted for that special assessment? All eyes turned to Veronica, who'd gone pale behind the head table. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. That's when Jessica stood up with a thick folder of documents. Actually, Jessica announced, Mrs. Ashford has known about the legitimate ownership claim for months. She also established a shell company to embezzle the special assessment funds, and she bribed a county clerk to destroy property records. Jessica began reading from Nancy's signed confession, obtained that morning with immunity guarantees from the State Attorney General's office. The room listened in stunned silence as the full scope of Veronica's crimes became clear: bribery, embezzlement, harassment under color of authority, and conspiracy to commit title fraud. But we weren't done yet. Eleanor Patterson had one more revelation that tied everything together. The original developers who sold you these houses, Eleanor announced, also defrauded the federal government out of rural development grants by claiming they owned land they'd only leased. The FBI has been investigating this case since 1993, but they could never locate the original landowner to confirm the fraud. She looked directly at me. Until now. That's when state investigators who'd been waiting outside entered the community center. Lead investigator Detective Sarah Lucy approached the head table with an arrest warrant. Veronica Ashford, Detective Lucy announced, you're under arrest for bribery of a public official, embezzlement and interference with a federal investigation. The handcuffs clicking around Veronica's wrists were audible in the dead-silent room. Lisa Chang's camera captured every moment as Veronica was led away in custody, her navy blazer wrinkled and her pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light one last time. But even with Veronica gone, we had 127 families to deal with. People who'd lived in their homes for decades, raised children, built lives, completely unaware they'd been victims of massive fraud. Deputy Martinez helped maintain order as I explained the resolution I was offering. Families could purchase their lots for $89,000, the original 1987 price that Clearwater should have paid my grandfather. Or they could enter month-to-month lease agreements for $850 per month. I'm not trying to destroy your community, I told them. I'm trying to fix a 33-year-old crime that victimized all of us. The meeting ended with residents forming small groups, discussing their options, asking questions about financing and legal procedures. Most seemed relieved to finally understand what had been happening and grateful that I wasn't demanding immediate payment of back rent. As people filed out of the community center, Mrs. Henderson stopped to shake my hand. Mr. Brewster, she said, I've been fighting HOA violations for 2 years. Now I know why. None of them had any legal authority to issue citations in the first place. She was right. For 3 decades, the residents of Willow Spring Estates had been governing property they didn't own, following rules enforced by people who had no legal standing to make them.